Okay, so reflection paper 6 is due tonight, right? And I'll bring y'all a sample annotated bibliography next time that we can look over and talk about so we all know what that is supposed to look like. You are reading Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail for next time. And remember to submit at least 3 words to the vocab folder. Does anybody have any questions about anything that's going on right now or going forward? Everything right now is pretty clear to everybody? Okay, great. So I actually want to start with a little exercise here. I want all of you to circle up if you can. Yeah, try to make...
our stuff?
What's that?
Do we need our stuff?
You should probably at least bring a notebook and a pen with you. But yeah, just make a circle. Do what you can. You don't have to move the desks if you don't want to, but yeah, just however you can manage it, circle up.
Like a circle with everybody?
Yep, everybody in a circle. You will, but probably not just yet. Okay. So here's what we're doing. All of you are members of a judicial body that has been formed by a new government with a new constitution. There are 2 major ethnic groups in this country, each of which is represented on the board proportionally, right? That is, get like the number on the board is representative of the share of the population, right? So group 1, being much smaller, is only going to have 2 members. Group 2, being substantially larger, is going to be everyone else, right? So Sydney and Brandon, you guys are going to be group 1, right? So it'd actually probably be better if you 2 sit together. So what I've laid out here are the known facts about the country and about each group, plus some circumstances that the research your body has done so far has uncovered, right? So as we said, group 1 is much smaller than group 2. It only represents about 10% of the total population of the country. But they ran the country's previous government under its old constitution. They're a settler population whose ancestors came to the country about 150 years ago. And they have most of the economic power in the country, right? So they don't have the numbers, but they own most of the land, most of the resources, most of the businesses, right? So they still have most of the country's wealth. When they were in charge, they did the following. They allowed Group 2 no political representation in the legislature. They cut off Group 2's access to elite educational institutions. They forced members of Group 2 to live in segregated neighborhoods and to obtain special passes if they wanted to travel outside of them. They allowed employers to discriminate against Group 2 in hiring practices, and they passed laws limiting free expression of political opinions by members of Group 2. In fact, there were instances in which police from Group 1 fired on unarmed protesters from Group 2, killing several and wounding many others, right? Now, Group 2, you all are natives of the country. You control the new government because you have numbers on your side, and it is a representative democracy rather than an oligarchy, right? So your grievances against Group 1 are largely detailed above here, right? Now below are their grievances against you. Members of Group 2 at one point attacked a group of police officers guarding a political prisoner, killing several and wounding many others. A band of saboteurs from Group 2 took over an electrical plant and threatened to destroy it if their demands for the release of political prisoners and a new constitution were not met. In the end, the police stormed the facility, killing the ringleaders and arresting other members of the group. A protest against travel restrictions became violent, and members of Group 2 forced their way into a Group 1 neighborhood, looting shops, setting fire to buildings, and injuring several civilians. In addition, members of Group 2 were apprehended in an attempt to assassinate the Group 1 Prime Minister. And finally, a rogue organization within Group 2 firebombed a Group 1 elementary school, killing several children and teachers. So you've got two groups here with a list of pretty severe grievances against one another, right? But because one group has the numbers and the other group has the resources, you have to figure out some way to move forward together, because the new constitution won't work without cooperation from both groups, right? So what your task here is to figure out what to do about these grievances, right? You've got a group of individuals at whom the blame for most of these actions can be laid, right? In Group 1, these are mostly former government officials, particularly those concerned with security and policing. In Group 2, these are leaders of popular resistance groups. And popular in two senses here, right? One, popular being of the people, right? And also, a number of these leaders are very personally popular with the population, with the general population, which makes punishing them more difficult, right? So you have the following options. There are a couple of things you can do. You can deal with the leaders of extremist factions in both groups harshly, right? Execution, exile, life imprisonment, whatever, right? Some kind of severe punishment for the leaders of various extremist factions, right? You can also decide that members of one group are more culpable, that is more responsible for the conflict, and that they should be more severely punished. You could also just forgive and forget and find everyone involved innocent of all charges. Or you could negotiate a settlement on some other terms which you will determine yourselves, right? So as you're deliberating here, as you're thinking about what to do and discussing with each other what to do, two things, right? One, remember that this is an imaginary exercise, right? So be respectful to one another. No shouting, no yelling, no insulting other people. And secondly, think about what the possible fallout would be for your new government for each of these choices, right? Weigh carefully the potential positives and negatives of each possible approach as you're trying to figure out what to do. Each of these choices involves some amount of peril, right? There's always a risk involved. And you want to try, like all of you are invested in making your new constitution work and making your new and helping your new democracy survive, right? So, with that, I will let you all get started and start talking through this together. Figure out what it is you want to do. And if members of the different groups want to huddle together and negotiate at various times, that's fine too, right? But yeah, I think, in fact, that's probably a good way to start here. Why don't, Group 1 and Group 2 huddle together first and decide what you want before you start talking to the whole group. Okay? All right.
Wait, so do we have to do this with like the thought of like we want our group to like keep more of the power, or like slightly more?
That's going to be up to you. It's going to be up to you whether you want to share power or whether you want to try to keep it for yourselves. And that's going to affect the choices you make, right? But remember that you're going to have to come up with something that's acceptable to them because they have more votes than you do. And y'all have to come up with something that's acceptable to them, or they're going to take all the money and leave the country with it, right?
Well, I don't think number 3 would work. I said I don't think number 3 would work. Number 2 might be better. Because it'll lead. They're associated. Because one would show them, but willing to work with them.
Creative foster that should be exiled from the new government. Whenever they merge, so you can't be like citizens or whatever those places.
So if we pick number 4, do we have to actually,
Come up with something?
Yeah, you will actually have to come up with something if you pick number 4.
Because if you look at 1, it says because in both groups, can't be protected for the natives and they want bars or something like that. And then also, on the front page of 1, that says they did, since they allowed us the political representation in the legislature. And they cut off our access to this education stuff, they literally just like screws everything. Exactly.
It's just like a country with states and provinces and like.
should be somewhere terms?
Let's say no because that would make it too complicated.
What do we do for them?
There's no
Maybe we should
to migrate
divide the crimes committed on
political
the
decisions.
into categories. Like more severe and less severe.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see. I'm gonna be fine.
They probably did more than once. The problem is, like, what's one of the issues with proving that the state has committed a crime against people?
Proving it to the state.
Yeah. So, you know, a lot of your political prisoners may have just kind of disappeared or met with accidents, right? That the state found a convenient explanation for. Right? You didn't buy it, nobody bought it, but you had no way to prove otherwise.
I think I don't want to take anything off the list.
Discontinuing all the laws made specifically
And all-
against group two.
So they would take off, yeah, I would take off. Like maybe, I would say definitely B. I would take that off. Because they never actually destroyed the plant. And they ended up being, murdered and arrested, so. And their demands were not unreasonable. So I would take B. We should probably keep E, considering children. That is easy to explain away.
What kind of key we didn't actually.
Is it a D? I was
Attempted to, were successful.
And then we're apprehended. B and C. C, no one actually got killed. So they'll probably want,
Then again, we included their shops, so probably.
they'll want retribution. Should we try to cross off 2 on the? I don't know if I can do
The
it.
promise that they dismantle their resistance groups, then we would redistribute the wealth to their smaller businesses.
Okay, so maybe we should not work on our settlement. How about we prosecute for 8 crimes? Not one. So like 1A through E and 2A, 2C, and 2B.
They just
And
will
we'll
get
get
resistance.
targets for B and D.
Wealth will be
So I'm trying to listen over the shoulder here, hear what you guys are saying. And I just want to remind you of one quick thing, right? They're not the resistance anymore. Yeah, they're in the government now, and there are more of them than there are of you.
So that's still. Because then we're all voting on it equally.
Yeah, exactly,
Okay,
yeah,
so it's
yeah.
still-
Mhm. Yep, yeah, every person here gets a vote. But because they're more of the population and it's now representative, right? They get more votes than you
And the prosecution for those things.
So I think we're gonna
Yeah, but there can still be repercussions for it.
maybe I will prosecute all the crimes and probably Protestants.
It is part of everything. It's part of 2. More so than. Do we have to come up with other settlement terms?
Well, what are you thinking?
I don't know. Depends on, like, what's the scope of this? Everything? Or just certain?
Let's try to keep the scope of this limited to the things that are on the list.
So let's see.
So yeah, remember, like, what you have to do here is try to balance the practical realities of running a government, right, with, at least some form of symbolic recompense for things that both groups have done to each other, right? Because if you don't deal with the emotional fallout of these things, right, then that may not blow up your government right away, but it will eventually.
So maybe we should. Like maybe, because I think no political representation kind of affects all of that stuff. Like, allow employers to discriminate in segregated neighborhoods.
Yeah, I mean, you couldn't say or do anything about it, right? Yeah.
We just.
So our only leeway in this is that we have the money.
Yeah, that's your power here.
So
That
they're
you-
only making decisions for us if we leave the government. They have a government in the land, but they have no money.
Yeah, you have control of just about all the resources. Yeah, so that's your power, that's your leverage, right? I mean, this is hard, right?
Maybe because we're prosecuting a equal amount, we could ask them to redistribute their wealth just a little. Different portion. Not all.
Just a tiny little wealth tax.
Portion of wealth. Anything else you want to add? No, they have the land and the resources. We have the population.
Yeah, most of that economic power.
Maybe we should threaten a strike. You know what I'm saying?
That's what I was-
We should
that's
threaten a
something
strike
with
so
our
that
land,
they
like
can't,
if they try,
they don't have workers. And then,
Yeah.
Very true.
so we can maybe strike.
So I was thinking something like that.
Maybe we
I
can.
like sitting here being done and listening to this.
Box up everything here and just threaten that with a strike.
It's like just hearing somebody talk crap about
You
your,
get all
money
that.
back.
You have behind your back, but in front of your face,
Yeah,
right?
literally.
That's, uh-huh. Yeah. Remember too, like that the part of the idea here is reconciliation, right? You all still have to live with each other.
Yeah.
No, I got better, I didn't know. We got the land, we know the land, we just go to war, we have our numbers and our knowledge of the land, and then there we go, we're all good.
Okay, maybe we'll scratch the strike.
What?
Reconciliation.
Yeah.
But how about we push for workers' rights?
There we go.
Yes, sir. I still think the war's
Yeah, but they still.
Yeah, no, I'm just kidding, yeah, that's what we all have to do. So, truth and reconciliation.
And remember too, right, that they have both more money
Yeah.
and also because they ran the government and the police force and the army, probably better training. So even though there are fewer of them, right, they can hire mercenaries.
Oh, yeah, that's true. A lot from
Right.
alliances because of their government relations.
Yep.
All right, I think we're ready.
All right.
Ready?
Are both sides ready?
I'll put ambulance person because I accidentally group two. I mean, they kind of like murder someone too.
So it's
All right. Anyone can start talking.
It's probably shorter, so we should go first. Okay, we've said that, to start off, we should exile all people or government officials who committed crimes against either group. So all of the people who tried to assassinate Prime Minister for your side and the people who committed a mass shooting to Group 2 would be exiled and wouldn't be allowed to be a part of the new country. Second, we put that we should allow Group 2 in-depth political discussion through the new government's constitution. And after that, we would discontinue any laws made specifically against any particular group, including segregation or educational,
Discrimination.
yeah. And last we put that if they disassemble all groups made to resist Group 1, then wealth would be distributed down to the smaller businesses equally.
All right. Group 2.
All right, so we said prosecution for 1A, 1B, and 1E, and 2A, 2C, and 2E. And we would like a portion of wealth distributed and workers' rights, considering we're the working population. I don't like the idea of exile personally.
Prosecution as in prison, I didn't do these things, so it's weird. It's like, are we supposed to act like we just straight murdered people?
No. Let's imagine
Because if I was
that
in
everyone
prison
here.
and I didn't do it, then I
Yeah.
would feel bad for the people that have been in prison on my side.
Yeah, so let's assume that each of you on this board is chosen because you are not guilty of any specific atrocities.
Okay, so we want not the peaceful, but like the non-violent.
Yeah,
Stay neutral.
you're all on this board because you were acceptable to everybody.
Yeah, and that works too.
Yeah.
But it has to go both ways, though. It would have to be
Uh-huh.
imprisonment for both people who did illegal things in Group 1 and Group 2.
Okay.
We crossed out two things for both groups. And
Two of y'all's get part and two of ours get part.
of course, we want wealth redistributed.
Things matched up. I don't think anything.
Yeah, I think they matched up pretty
Mhm.
well.
Yeah.
Yeah, you actually, y'all came to pretty similar lists of what's acceptable to you.
I think it kind of helps that we're not really in these positions.
Yeah.
Because if we were
Right?
really rich and we were trying to keep our wealth, we probably would be nice.
Exactly, yeah, but because it's imaginary money, right? It's a lot easier to give it away. And yeah, I mean, it is a lot easier to resolve this kind of conflict when you're just students sitting around a table.
In a weird circle.
Yeah, in a weird circle, yeah. The best circle we could make with these kind of desks. Working through an imaginary exercise, right? But the reason I wanted y'all to do this is because this is kind of exactly what people went through in South Africa in the 1990s as the apartheid government was dismantled, right? I tried, the situation here doesn't mirror that exactly. For one thing, I think there was actually equal representation of various communities on the board. And they came to a slightly different solution than you did. I mean, you have to weigh consequences that have effect, in that case, consequences that have real effects on real people's lives, right? And in the case of the commission that Desmond Tutu chaired, what they decided to do, right, was neither punishment for everybody, nor blanket amnesty, nor even really punishment for some and amnesty for others, right? They offered an amnesty with specific conditions attached to it, right? So if you wanted the amnesty, right, whether you had been with the old apartheid government or whether you've been with one of the resistance groups, right, you only got the amnesty if you were willing to make a full confession of your particular crimes into the historical record, right? You had to make a full confession, and it had to be public. So everyone had to know exactly what you had done. Now, why do you think they went with this route? What would be the advantages or disadvantages, do you think, of going in this direction?
Public confession.
Okay. And what's good about public confession?
Well, what I thought it was like, I guess you could be marginalized maybe.
Okay, yeah, I mean, you could, it could identify people who've done the worst things, right? Who could then be marginalized, right? But this was often not what happened. For example, in a similar process in Northern Ireland, the end result of this was that the people who ended up as first minister and deputy first minister, because God forbid you call one of them second minister, right? Were the leaders of the most violent paramilitary groups, right? Ian Paisley, the radical Protestant leader, or reactionary Protestant leader, really, became the first minister, and Martin McGuinness, who was a leader of Sinn Féin, the nationalist militia, was deputy first minister, right? So these were both people who, if they had not killed anyone, if they had not killed people themselves, they definitely probably signed the death orders, right? So that doesn't necessarily end up with people being marginalized, right? But let's try another little quick thought experiment here. I want you to think about a time when you did something maybe underhanded or not quite kosher to a friend or a loved one. And you could have completely gotten away with them not knowing you'd ever done it, right? So see if you can identify a moment like that in your own past, right? When you did something you knew you shouldn't have to a friend or a relative, but you also knew you could get away with it, right? That they'd never have to find out. Now, y'all are young yet. You may not have very many of these kinds of instances, right? But can anybody think of anything?
No.
No?
It's kind of embarrassing, but as an elementary school child, I used to take money out of my brother's wallet
Uh-huh.
and use it.
Okay.
I've done that before.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And he doesn't know to this day.
Okay, and you still haven't told him that you did that. Yeah, he still does not
I mean,
know.
he probably won't care, but
Yeah. But I think like the did somebody else want to say something, or like was that a hand up or you're scratching your head? Okay. But and these that's just kind of like minor kid stuff, right? But if you do something really bad to another person, right, especially if it's another person that you have to see every day, and you don't tell them, right? It's just going to keep eating at you. It's going to fester. It's not going to go away. right? So when Desmond Tutu, for example, sets up these different examples of ways that other countries have dealt with this, right? So for example, he talks about the Nuremberg Trials in Germany, right? So do y'all know anything about the Nuremberg Trials?
Heard of it.
Okay.
That's just about it.
Okay.
Prosecution of Nazis.
Yeah, exactly. This was the prosecution of Nazi officials for war crimes.
Yeah.
And the end result of the Nuremberg trials was that the vast majority of top German and Austrian officials were judged complicit in war crimes and were either, imprisoned for life or executed in many cases. And at any rate, were largely barred from public life afterward, right? Now, who ran the Nuremberg trials? This is something that Desmond Tutu actually does mention.
The winning side.
Yeah, the trials were run by representatives from the Allied powers, right? So the Americans, the British, the Russians, right? And this is not to say that the conclusions that they came to were wrong, right? This is not to say that they should not have punished Nazis for war crimes. But what advantage do they have in making these kinds of harsh sentences?
Numbers.
What's that?
Numbers.
Okay, yeah, they're the winners, right?
Yeah.
They've got victory on their side.
They get to leave.
Yeah, that's the point Tutu makes, right? Is that they don't have to stick around when this is over, right? They don't have to see these people in the streets, right? They don't have to read about these people in the newspaper. They don't have to deal with this anymore.
It's easier because they're not from there, they don't live there.
Exactly.
They live across the world.
Exactly. It's not their country. Yeah. Yeah, sure, go ahead. It's not their country. They can just go back and this is over, right? They don't have to deal with any fallout. Again, please do not take this to mean that I think that they were wrong, right? I am not on any level here trying to defend the people who were prosecuted at Nuremberg, right? I'm just trying to present Tutu's argument here about why this particular model wouldn't work for South Africa, right? Because you're dealing here with people who still have to live with each other and still have to face each other. Now, the other model that he presents is Chile, right? When the right-wing dictatorship of Augustin Pinochet fell. And so let's actually sort of go there and look at the way he describes this on page 373. So when everybody gets there, can I get somebody to read the paragraph for me that starts, then there were others who opposed the trial option.
What page did you say?
373.
Then there were others who opposed the trial option and suggested rather blindly that we let bygones be bygones. This was much sought after by the members of the previous government and those who had carried out their behest in their security forces. They clamored for a blanket for a general amnesty as had happened in, for instance, Chile, where General Augusto Pinochet and his cohorts gave themselves amnesty as a precondition to handing over from their military junta to a civilian government. Even though they agreed to the appointment of a truth commission, such a commission would deliberate only behind closed doors, and the record of General Pinochet and his government and the security forces would not be scrutinized by the commission, certainly not for the purpose of apportioning blame. It has been important in the whole debate over impunity to point out that General Pinochet and his officers and government forgave themselves. They alone knew what precisely they had done. They were the accused, the prosecution, and the judges in their own case. In the absence of amnesty designed, as it was in South Africa, to establish accountability, I am a strong supporter of the recent extradition proceedings against General Pinochet. It would be quite intolerable that the perpetrator should decide not only whether he should get amnesty, but that no one else should have the right to question the grounds on which he had so granted himself amnesty, and for what offense.
Okay, thank you, James. So what's the problem that Tutu was pointing out here with the way Chile dealt with the handover of power to a new civilian democratic government?
The military junta judged themselves.
Yeah, the people who had committed potential war crimes and crimes against humanity got to decide for themselves whether or not they were guilty, right? So yeah, so the accused were their own judges. And what's the other problem he points out with it? Particularly as relates to what was finally decided in South Africa as to what was the right path forward. What else is wrong with, according to Tutu, the decision made in Chile?
The records were not
Yeah,
scrutinized.
yeah. Is anybody who wasn't in that room ever going to know any of this information? So yeah, the other problem here is, yeah, because this takes place behind closed doors, right? The other problem is secrecy. And we can actually locate this as a kind of, as like one of the big binaries that the essay is built on is this opposition between transparency and secrecy, right? So let's take it back to near the beginning of the essay, page 368. Can I get somebody to start reading the paragraph that starts with South Africa remembered that several people had died mysteriously? Bottom of page 368, it's South Africa remembered that several people had died mysteriously.
South Africa remembered that several people had died mysteriously while they were in police detention. It was allegedly by the authorities who may perhaps have been believed by most of the white community. They were certainly not believed by most of the black community. They had committed suicide by hanging themselves with their belts, or they slipped on soap while showering, or they tended to have a penchant for jumping out of the windows of buildings where they were being detained and questioned. Others died, so we were told, from self-inflicted injuries. One such was Steve
Steve Biko.
Biko, the young student founder of the Black Consciousness movement. It was said he had banged his head against the wall in an inexplicable and quite unreasonable altercation with his interrogators in September 1977. People recall that when the then Minister of the Police was told Steve's death, he had
Callously.
and memorably declared that his death leaves me cold. People recall that Steve had been driven naked on the back of a police truck 1,500 kilometers to Pretoria, where it was reported he would have received medical treatment, except that he died soon after he arrived there. No one ever explained why he could not have the emergency treatment in Port Elizabeth, where he had been detained, nor why he had to be taken to Pretoria. He had to be humiliated, comatose as he was, by being transported without any clothes on.
Okay, so thank you. So what is the upshot of this, right? What is Tutu trying to point out here about secrecy and transparency? What's clearly actually happening to these political prisoners who are being detained? Yeah, they're being tortured and in some cases killed, right? And what is the government saying has happened to them?
They're just making up stuff.
Yeah.
Their people didn't do it, but the other stuff is happening.
Yeah, that it was you know, he just happened to jump out of a window, right? Or like
especially on the slip-on soap in the shower thing.
yeah, I mean,
They
like,
themselves with their own belts.
yeah, I mean, like they're stories that don't hold up to scrutiny, right?
Like, except for the shower thing, everything else, they just like say they did hang themselves with their belts. They did jump out of windows. They wouldn't do that for no reason, especially like killing yourself. Like, they're not gonna want to like be at that state where they're gonna want to kill themselves if they weren't like torturing them or something like that. They just need to get out of it.
Yeah. Well, and if we look at like the government narrative that Tutu relates of Steve Biko's story, right? It's like, well, one, why would he suddenly, while in detention, start banging his own head against a wall, right? Why would they have to drive him to this place some distance away to get him emergency treatment rather than getting it to him right there for a head injury, right? And
Why was he naked?
exactly, yeah. Why did he have to be naked on the back of a truck?
Humiliate them on the way there.
Exactly,
Instead
yeah.
of just easily taken to get taken care of there, that needed to humiliate him along the way.
Yeah. So what's the point here that's being made about transparency and secrecy? Why is transparency in this situation so necessary as the former government and the people who were oppressed by the former government are now negotiating with each other? What is missing from that relationship? So if we look at, so the government had been telling these kinds of stories about political prisoners from the oppressed part of the population, right, that don't hold up to scrutiny. So when these two groups get together and try to hammer out an agreement, how are the formerly oppressed group likely to react to members of the first group and to any offers that they make?
Hostile.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're like,
They're gonna get mad about it, of course.
yeah, they're likely to be hostile, and they're likely to be hostile in part because they don't trust them, right? There's no trust there, right? Hence the importance of transparency, right? Hence the importance of public storytelling, right? We set the record straight to establish trust where there is no trust. Right? If you are willing to tell your story in full on the historical record and cop to everything you did, and our guys do the same, then we have a basis for moving forward, right? Then we have a basis for trusting one another. Because as conditions existed in the previous government, right, they have no reason to trust each other. And in fact, we even see the way the old legal system used to work, right? You would have people in the old boys network hang together rather than actually trying to honestly explore the truth. Or if you turn to page 371, right? Most distressingly, we discovered in the course of the TRC investigations and work that the supporters of apartheid were ready to lie at the drop of a hat. This applied to cabinet ministers, commissioners of police, and of course those in the lower echelons as well. They lied as if it were going out of fashion, brazenly and with very considerable apparent conviction. In the courts, it was the word of one bewildered victim against that of several perpetrators. Other officers in the police or armed forces who perjured themselves, as they have now admitted in their applications for amnesty. It would have to be a very brave judge or magistrate who would find in favor of the solitary witness, who would, in addition, have the further disadvantage of being black, facing a phalanx of white police officers who really could never do such a dastardly thing as to lie in court, right? So what's the only reason, he's saying, we now know that these officers and officials lied in court? Why do we know it now?
Because they offered amnesty.
Yeah, because they offered the amnesty, right? They copped to it. Right? They admitted their guilt when offered the public amnesty. So we're now able, he's saying here, to set the record straight in a lot of these cases because we decided to go this way, right? Now to continue on here. No wonder the judicial system gained such a notorious reputation in the black community. It was taken for granted that the judges and magistrates colluded with the police to produce miscarriages of justice. Until fairly recently, the magistrates and judges were all white, sharing the apprehensions and prejudices of their white compatriots, secure in enjoying the privileges that the injustices of apartheid provided them so lavishly, and therefore inclined to believe that all opposition to that status quo was communist-inspired and generally supporting the executive and the legislative branches of government against the black person who was excluded by the law from a share in the governance of his motherland. Many judges in the old dispensation were blatantly political appointees, and they did nothing to redeem the reputation of the judiciary as a willing collaborator with an unjust dispensation. Of course, there were some exceptions, but by and large, the dice were heavily loaded against the black litigant or accused or complainant. It will take some time for our black people to have confidence in the police and the judicial system, which was so badly discredited in the bad old days. So I think that there is actually, apart from just a kind of indictment of the judicial system here, there's something else going on that speaks to a larger cultural issue, right? Do the judges and officials that he's talking about here, do they believe themselves to be lying or to be at fault for any miscarriage of justice? Why or why not? Are these guys knowingly sitting in a corner plotting together and, rubbing their hands together and thinking about how they're going to screw people?
They're like support for the executive and legislative.
Yeah, they are themselves situated in a particular racial and socioeconomic dynamic, right? That encourages them to look at the world a particular way. right? To look at the world in a way that maintains a status quo which just happens to benefit them, right? We can actually probably compare this to what happens near the end of The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, right? If we think back to our last session, what's the process that people in Omelas go through once they learn about the suffering child?
Acceptance or unacceptance.
Yeah, they eventually, most of them, right, the vast majority of them, come to, like, they may be upset when they first peel back the curtain and discover what's going on, right? But eventually, they come to accept it because it's easier, right? Because this is simpler than trying to square whether this is just or not, right? So through a kind of motivated reasoning, they come to a kind of self-justification. But I think that the point, the larger point that Tutu is getting to in this and in the next paragraph, is that truth is to some extent relative. All right, what's true depends on the angle you're looking at something from. So, two eyewitnesses, for example, standing on different corners, witnessing something happen, right, may have completely different narratives of that event because they really didn't see exactly the same thing. Right? Their positions relative to that thing were different. Plus, we also know from various psychological studies of eyewitness testimony, right, that our memories are actually incredibly unreliable, and that we often make up things to fill in gaps, right, among other things. So, if we look at the rest of page 372 here, right? When it came to hearing evidence from victims, because we were not a criminal court, we established facts on the basis of probability. Since we were exhorted by our enabling legislation to rehabilitate the human and civil dignity of victims, we allowed those who came to testify mainly to tell their stories in their own words. We did do all we could to corroborate those stories, and we soon discovered that, as Judge Albie Sachs, a member of our constitutional court, has pointed out, there were in fact different orders of truth which did not necessarily mutually exclude one another. There was what could be termed forensic factual truth, verifiable and documentable, and there was social truth, the truth of experience that is established through interaction, discussion, and debate. So the truth that matters here for Tutu, right, is not so much the forensic truth of what happened when and who did what, right? What matters here, particularly if we're talking about reconciliation of two communities that have no reason to trust each other, is to get at that social and emotional truth, right? And if you don't air all of these things in public, then you don't get that social and emotional catharsis, right, that allows for social coherence. Now, there's one more thing I want to point out here in terms of sort of close reading here, that I don't know if any of you picked up on this, but there's a kind of metaphor that Tutu is using throughout the piece. And I'm just going to point to some examples of it, and you tell me if you can spot what it is, right? So if we go to page 368, the first sentence here, right? The debilitating legacy of apartheid is going to be with us for many a long day yet. And then if we go to his discussion of blanket amnesty, right? He says the general amnesty was really amnesia. Right, on the previous page, he talks about, these individuals who were frequently uneducated and unsophisticated, bewildered, and even more traumatized than before, right? Whereas many bore witness to the fact that coming to talk to the commission had had a marked therapeutic effect on them. Right, he talks about, on page 375, Alzheimer's disease, right, a disease of memory. And rehabilitation, right, he uses the word rehabilitate. So, do we see here a pattern in language here? What's going on? What do these words have in common with each other? What do they all refer to?
Medicine?
Yeah, it's a lot of medical and disease terminology, right? Right, so much like Rachel Carson was, using this kind of war metaphor, right, to describe the way we were constantly bombarding our environment with chemicals. Tutu is talking about attempts to deal with the legacy of apartheid in terms not just of disease, but particularly diseases of memory, right? Right, that what does amnesia, for example, do to you? What does it mean to have amnesia? What's that?
Memory loss.
Yeah.
Alzheimer's. And
Yeah, amnesia and Alzheimer's are both concerned with memory loss. And what does memory loss do to our sense of identity?
When you're not lucid, you slowly lose your sense of identity.
Yeah. If you can't remember, right? Or if you remember poorly or incorrectly, then you're not the same person you were, right? So memory loss is also kind of identity loss, right? So what he's suggesting here is a way for people to move forward, not just by acknowledging the pain they cause, right? But by acknowledging the necessity of remembering in order to know who they are. Right, so it's about forming an identity and maintaining an identity, right? Not just about moving a political process forward. Right, you can't do that second thing without doing the first thing. And just one last quick thing I want to introduce here is this idea he mentions of Ubuntu. Were you able to figure out more or less what Ubuntu means from the way he defines it here? Okay, James, you're nodding. What is it? He talks about it on page 375.
It kind of sounds like our word, like humanity, almost.
Okay.
That's what it reminds me of, what he described.
Okay, how so?
He said, someone has Ubuntu, generous, hospitable, friendly, caring, compassionate.
Uh-huh.
And I think humanity can describe someone who has those traits.
Okay. And let's kind of think about other things we might think of in terms of hospitable, friendly, caring, compassionate, right? Apart from like simply humanity, we're like, what else do those traits have in common with each other? What are they all concerned with?
Other humans.
Yeah, they're concerned with other people and how you treat other people, right? So someone who has Ubuntu, right? I think what it might be more accurately translated here as, somebody who has pro-social values. Right? That's a little bit clunkier than humanity, right? But I think it makes sense in terms of what he is describing here, right? Harmony, friendliness, community are great goods. Social harmony is for us the summum bonum, the greatest good. Anything that subverts, that undermines this sought-after good is to be avoided like the plague, right? Another disease word. Anger, resentment, lust for revenge, even success through aggressive competitiveness are corrosive of this good. To forgive is not just to be altruistic, it is the best form of self-interest. What dehumanizes you inexorably dehumanizes me. It gives people resilience, enabling them to survive and emerge still human despite all efforts to dehumanize them. So the humanity that we find in ourselves, Tutu seems to believe, I would argue, we find through our interactions with others, right? That we're defined not so much by our personal qualities as we are by our relations with our communities, right? That our community context is the thing that really defines what we are. Hence the importance of healing this breach within the South African community, right? So what do y'all think of this?
The Amnesia kind of reminds me of, I think Confucius he had fear of punishment.
Okay. Yeah, and let's to go back to, does everybody remember what Confucius says about law and punishment? Is someone who obeys the law because he fears punishment actually good? No, yeah, you're not doing the right thing because what's that?
I was like, finishing your sentence.
Yeah,
For
go
the
ahead.
right reason.
Yeah, it's not because you're intrinsically motivated to do good, right? You're just,
You're fearful, so you decide to do it.
yeah, you're doing it because you're afraid someone's going to put you in jail, right? And yeah, I think that, there is a reward here, right, for people who do the right thing. So they may be, motivated by the fact they're not going to jail if they do this. But then they also have to live with the public knowing exactly what they've done, right? So it's not, it's not a decision that people would have to make lightly, especially if they're the sort of people who could otherwise just go undetected, right? So yeah, I think that there is like some possible application of Confucius to a certain extent. I think it's a good observation. Anybody else? Okay, well, we're about at time anyway, and I brought the wrong thumb drive, so I don't have the reading questions from Martin Luther King, so I'll email those to you this afternoon. Yeah, so we'll meet again on Thursday to talk about the letter from William J.